I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for the morning. It is Mr. Jack Waters, who is Chief Technical Officer of Level 3 Communications. Level 3, as Jack says, arguably runs the largest world internet backbone network. He holds a BSEE from West Virginia University, a master's degree in electrical engineering from Johns Hopkins. He was one of 10 employees at Level 3 14 years ago. Level 3 today employs more than 10,000 employees. He has seen their network grow to over 135,000 route miles. He's been intimately involved, and I believe he said he ran the integration team of the acquisition of Global Crossing, which has significantly expanded the footprint for Level 3. He has led Level 3 to numerous milestones in the growth of their network, including IP communications, soft switching, MPLS, advanced optical networking, and all of that powers their internet traffic network. He's been greatly involved in the steering of Level 3's network to become a media-enabled network. And so as Asterisk becomes a media-enabled platform, we need media-enabled networks to connect all of these things. And he is also a member of the FCC's Technical Advisory Council. At this point, I hope you'll give a big AfriCon welcome to Mr. Jack Waters.
Good morning. How's everybody? How many people have been to Colorado before? How many people thought they were going to see snow this week? Really? I was pretty surprised. So welcome. For those that don't know, Level 3 is just up the road here, about 10 minutes away. A little history on Level 3. We started the company about 14 years ago in Omaha, Nebraska, and there were a few of us traveling around trying to figure out exactly where we wanted to locate the company. And we hired Arthur Anderson, if you remember them, no longer around, to interview outgoing seniors of college to figure out where we should locate our company, where the best place was to hire people graduating from college. And it turns out that Colorado has a really high positive. Evidently, there's this thing in election polling. There's high positives and low negatives. And it turns out that Boulder, Colorado has high positives and low negatives. So that's why we're here. So good morning to everybody. Thanks for having me. My talk today is really going to focus around two things. First, a little historical perspective on media-enabled networks. And then second, a little bit of my thoughts of where media-enabled networks are heading and where this community may fit in. But first, 13 to 14 years ago, what was a media-enabled network? It was a voice network. When we started our company, media-enabled network was all about voice. In fact, if you looked at the revenues in the United States for telecom services, 90% of all revenues were voice. 10% was data. I started my career a little bit earlier at MCI, and I worked for MCI in the early 90s, and I started to make this slide for my boss at MCI around 1994, and it was a now obviously I continued it here for a while afterwards, but the slide shows voice traffic and internet traffic, and if you had projected it out, pick your number. Back in the mid-90s, the internet was growing 100% every 6 months, if you believed one set of folks, every 18 months, if you believed another. It was pretty robust. Voice traffic was actually growing at about 6% a year. This slide is essentially the reason why we started our company. And it was all about, hey, we think that over time, building a new telecom company out of, kind of seems silly now in 2011, but out of internet technology was probably a place where you could gain a lot of investment and build something that no one else had built. We also believed back then that there were three significant technology shifts. The first is one I think that's apparent to everybody here in the room, market-based standards. And we used to use the VHS and Betamax example. I think that there's a more relevant and more recent example of a market-based standard, and that's HD DVD and Blu-ray. Consumer-based, but it's a good example of two very similar technologies able to produce very similar results, but the market chose one over the other. And it was because vendors got behind it, content owners got behind it, and then users ultimately adopted it. The other was around IP technology, and once again, it seems a little silly to even talk about IP today, but if you remember back 14 years ago, there's a big question about what communications technology was actually going to prevail. ATM, everybody remember ATM? Not automatic teller machine, but the other one. Frame relay, X25. That was a big question back then. In fact, at MCI, I used to spend every other month, I'd have to go to the leaders of the company and explain why this internet thing was really something important and not what was called ham radio at the time. And then finally, optical technology. You might say, well, optical technology or transport technology has been around in telecom. It's hard to really say that it's a market-based standard, but it actually was. In the early 1990s, Sprint, a very small fiber count network in the US, was running out of capacity. And they needed a way to get more capacity on their network. They weren't going to go dig up. It was actually a direct buried network. There weren't conduits actually put in the ground when they built their network. So they had to find a way to increase the capacity of their network. The way they did that was they found a little company called Ciena, and Ciena built the first WDM, or wave division multiplexing network, that was used. And it was all market-based. There weren't any standards behind it, and then the market developed around it. So those were the three. Sorry, I'll move on here. As part of our early days, we actually took an oath that we would never buy a circuit switch, that we were going to build our company, we were going to build it on new technology, and we were not going to take the easy route and go buy DMS 500s, 250s, 5Es to get into the voice market. And we actually made up buttons that had no circuit switching. I don't know if anybody remembers the level 3 buttons. Lots of people used to pass them around. We actually went to Bellcore and provided this drawing. This is the original soft switch patent that we own. And we went to Bellcore and said, boy, we want to build this piece of technology. We're fine. We don't have to build it ourselves, but we want to build it. And the folks at Bellcore were very kind and told us it would take 5 years and a couple $100 million. We didn't like that answer, so we went out and bought a little company in Cambridge, Massachusetts called XCOM Technologies, and started on our way to building our own software. We hired a bunch of software developers, perhaps some folks that are even in the room here, and went on to start to build our own soft switch. Now, along the way, the notion of media-enabled networks started to change a little bit. We ended up, there was a big trend in the voice network in the kind of 98, 99 time frame. Do you remember what it was? Dial-up? You guys remember dial-up? Dial-up is... That's a graph of our actual dial-up traffic, calls per day, when we started. And this actually represented a pretty tough technical challenge for the PSTN. The RBOCs were having a hard time keeping up with demand, the likes of AOL, Earthlink, United Online, remember them, Net Zero, were all hooking up millions of customers. And it was kind of throwing a wrench into all the voice planning that we were used to as engineers. Remember Erlang tables? Everybody remember Erlang tables? Erlang tables were the statistics that you used to figure out call occupancy and load on network and all kinds of stuff. That was the basic premise of all Erlang tables, was 3-minute call hold times for voice networks. And when dial-up came around, that was 20 to 30-minute call hold time. So it kind of blew up the PSTN. This graph shows that kind of at the peak, we were carrying about 1.1, almost 1.2 billion calls a day at 30 minutes per call. At that time, that made us the third largest local exchange carrier in the country, and we were just 4 years old. So the media-enabled network and the change that it represented was big for us at the time. Now, as part of the whole journey, we also recognized that we didn't want to be in the software and hardware business. We were using general purpose computers, but we were building our own software. So we spent a lot of time in the community. Does anybody remember any of these? The SoftSwitch Consortium, anybody remember that? Anybody was a part of that? That actually started in Colorado here. There were lots of protocols that we threw out, some reference designs, our original implementation of IPDC. We participated in the development of Megaco. We also participated heavily in things like IP trunking, SIP. At the time, if you remember, H323 was a competitor. SIP kind of won because it was easier. And we thought it was incredibly important to develop a community that took over for where our development was clearly we were never going to keep pace with the market. So how did that change the industry? Well, lots of folks got into the business. In fact, every major voice switch operator at the time developed a VoIP strategy, developed a distributed switch architecture, and went on to build decent businesses, both existing carriers as well, or vendors, as well as startups like Sonus at the time. So, at the heart of all this, development, we believe, and I really believe, that a community of developers, vendors, carriers is going to develop technology faster and better than any standards committee. And I think that's probably why all you guys are here in the room. So I applaud the effort. So what do media networks look like today? Has anybody ever seen this graph before? It's the Cisco Video Network Index. It's a projection of what video will look like over the next 5 or 6 years. There's a couple of important points here. One is, if you look at 2010 and the orange part of the graph, that's video. The bottom part is all other, and it's roughly 50-50. Now, if you consider the fact that peer-to-peer is actually not counted as video in this graph, video is probably already more than 50% as of last year of traffic carried on the internet. So we're already starting at a base of more than 50% of all traffic is carried, is video on the internet. If you listen to stats about Netflix, for instance, Netflix represents more than half of all peak hour traffic on all cable companies in the United States today. So video is where it's at. If you believe this projection says that by 2015, video will grow 6 times. So it's a pretty amazing growth rate for video. Grab a drink here. So with all that, we took a step back a couple years ago and said, wow, this is kind of an important trend for us to understand, and led us to this thing called content delivery networks. Has everybody heard of CDNs? A CDN, let me spend a minute and explain a little bit as what a CDN is. A CDN is very simply a set of storage, a place to store content. We'll call that origin storage, and then a number of distributed caches around the network. Think of it this way. An end user requests a piece of content, a movie. Through the magic of lots of algorithms, domain name system, that end user, your PC on your desk at home or your little Blu-ray player connected to your TV is redirected to a place on a network that's more geographically close to that end system. If it's the first time that content is ever requested to that local resource, content is downloaded from the origin to that local resource and then downloaded to the user. The second time a user geographically close to that first guy is requesting that same piece of content, obviously the cache holds the piece of content and the content is served. Pretty simple, not anything too complicated. We thought so too, but it turns out it's pretty tough to do this. And for all the reasons, folks in the room are spending their days and nights looking at this sort of development, we looked really hard at this development and said, boy, it's complicated. It's probably going to take a lot of time. And there are a ton of intellectual property issues surrounded around CDN. So what did we do? We went and did the same thing we did 11 years ago, found a company that owned some of the original patents for CDN and purchased that company. That company was called Sandpiper. They held some of the original CDN. They were part of Savvis. For those that don't remember, they went through a round of different owners and ended up at Savvis, and we purchased them from Savvis a handful of years ago. Today, our CDN, 13,000 servers in 50 locations around the world. It is a massive piece of infrastructure that has grown. If you look at the actual growth rate from 2007 when we acquired the company to today, that's not made up numbers. Those aren't projections. Yes, it has a lot to do with one big customer you read about all the time, but that's a 50x growth. And if you're thinking, well, that must have just been a small number in 2007, that 2007 number includes the fact that they had one large customer, which was Microsoft, and they did all the software downloads for Microsoft in 2007. So give you a little bit of scale how big this CDN has grown. So how's all this fit into the folks in the room, with the folks in the room, and asterisks? And first, I have to preface my comments by saying I am not an asterisk expert. I've watched the community. I certainly have seen the developments, but I'm not an expert. You all are. But I think that there are some common beliefs in the room. And the first is around the fact that market-based standards and communities really do work. And if you look at examples, Linux, people forget how long ago Linux actually started, early 90s, around 1992, in fact. Linux started. Big open source community developed and clearly has flourished. Soft switches, I think, continue to be a great example of that market-based standard and that community that's developed. IP. Wasn't clear 15 years ago that IP was the communications protocol. It became market-based. And then finally, asterisk. Today you have an incredibly large market-driven ecosystem. We were talking about it before. There's somewhere around 300,000 or so, it's a guess, 300,000 or so deployments of asterisk. That's a pretty big footprint. And it's a really big footprint to take capability and put it on. So, the second belief I think we all share is we should follow the demand. Where is the demand coming from? Our CEO, Jim Crow, for those that have met him, he's got a really interesting observation around the fact that the last 100 years of telecom were all about connecting people's ears. And the next handful of decades, if not the next 100 years, is going to be all about connecting people's eyes. And I think that's a pretty profound and correct thing that's true. And if you look at where you guys are headed, I happened to look at the Asterisk 10.0 after I was talking to a few folks, the release notes, improved media handling, basic video conferencing. I think it's the exact right place to head. And here's why. If you talk to any enterprise CIO and you ask them what's one of your top 10 challenges, they'd say video. No question. And when I hear this, I think of two things. I think of video conferencing, and I think of internet video consumption. So split them up for a second. Video conferencing comes in many different flavors, from Skype to telepresence. There are lots of different standards out there. It's been around for a really long time. And still today, enterprises struggle with video conferencing. It's not as simple as the end user wants. It's not as intuitive. It doesn't integrate as well with the end user. And I think that's, when you consider the footprint that the Asterisk platform has, I think it's an incredible opportunity for you all to focus in on those efforts. The second is around internet video consumption. And you might say, well, what the heck does this have to do with enterprise? People shouldn't be watching internet video at work. And a lot of companies just deal with the problem by policy. They say, you know what, we don't want our employees to watch video. But honestly, I don't believe that's reality. If you look at March Madness, go talk to an enterprise CIO, they'll tell you that March Madness is the single most difficult week of running their network that they have. All the games during the day, people are watching them, people are watching the Masters, people are watching Roland Garros, all of those different events that are happening. And I go back to the platform that you all have and say, boy, this is an opportunity. This really is an opportunity for the platform. I'll just conclude with a couple of thoughts. First, I do think that media-enabled networks have evolved. They've evolved from voice and dial-up to now video content networks. I think the shift in demand for video is a place that is a good place for you all to spend your time. And then finally, congratulations to the ecosystem you guys have built. It's a pretty impressive platform at 300,000 plus, I'd say, deployments, and good luck to you all. Thank you very much. We good on? If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind taking a question or two, or I can talk about anything you have questions on. Go ahead, and I'll try to repeat the question.
How are you guys dealing with the requirements for the change in density of traffic, especially with Netflix? Are you guys able to really keep up with this, or are you guys having to take some extreme measures to handle the scalability issue?
The question is, how are we keeping up with the demands of Netflix, and how are we keeping up? And it's been an interesting year, I'd say. We have deployed more hardware than we have in all years prior, so it's been a pretty busy year. I think there are a couple of areas that we've done well, and a couple of areas that are really interesting. I will put a plug in. We do have a very somewhat public fight now with a cable company, so I'll try to steer away from that if you don't mind. But besides that little interconnection issue, it's really why we build our network. The network that we've built, it was absolutely built to scale. We don't worry a lot about things like fiber count and those sorts of things that many others would. So at the most basic layer, I think we're in good shape. The challenges of scale are really in two areas. Can we build our IP network big enough and fast enough? And we've taken the route of building our IP network out of commodity hardware rather than real specialized hardware, and that's actually turned into a really good thing. We've ended up being able to scale that infrastructure in a pretty significant way, and we have a roadmap and path to be able to scale that probably 10x from where we are today. So we feel really good about that. The next is much as what you guys get to take advantage of, we get to take advantage of the price performance improvements of commodity hardware servers and disks. So every year and a half, we get the Moore's Law doubling, and it's a great thing. It is a great thing, and we see that improvement. So we're sort of, without even trying, now my guys probably wouldn't appreciate that comment, they're trying really hard, but we do get the improvement of hardware, both storage and basic compute power, those improvements kind of as we buy into the market. Go ahead.
What is your feeling about the net neutrality and the multi-tier networks that we're having talked about coming out in the public internet?
What is my feeling about net neutrality and the public tier networks? You know, this is close to the little cable company fight that we have, so I'll try to stay down the fairway here. But, you know, I think we all, and I'll take myself out of my job for a second and say this is a little bit of my personal belief, that we all should be real concerned about the fact that there is a path where the walled garden could be how consumers only get content over time. I don't believe that's going to be the case, because I think the fact that over-the-top content has gained such momentum, it's going to be hard for that to change direction, which is going to require networks to become more neutral about the content that rides over top of them. I think the consumer will drive that desire, and at some point, you know, the folks who own that piece of infrastructure are going to have to get behind it, because the momentum's going to be so great. I've worked with this guy for about 18 years, and he's got this saying that I love, and I think it's a message to the folks who own all the access networks. When they're running you out of town, get in front and call it a parade. And I think that's kind of what they need to do.
So what percentage of your voice network right now is encrypted, and how do you see demand from your customers as far as security on this network, and specifically voice?
Question is, what percentage of our network, of our voice network, is encrypted? And I'd say almost none. Very, very little. You know, we are the underlying provider to Skype in the U.S. So nearly all of the PSTN connectivity from the Skype platform out into the PSTN is done over level 3. So that portion of that internal part up to our interfaces are encrypted, as is well publicized. But our network itself, very, very little is encrypted. We have a significant amount of voice traffic today, of voice-only traffic. So we see a lot of the market, and we don't see it really as a big public part, obviously, of our voice network. But you know, I'd be interested if that's a requirement that you all are seeing more internal between, you know, customer sites and those things. Go ahead.
With respect to the contact center, like how you view that section of your business right now and what your projections are for the future with trends in technology and just general demand for contact centers with live people?
Yeah, the question around what do I see as the path for contact centers, I think it's really changing. You know, we are a supplier clearly to a lot of contact centers, and as you well know, those contact centers internally are changing how where they have their agents. Some of them there's a company down the road, I'm drawing a blank on their name, the folks that have remote home agents. Then they do all of the call routing to the home over IP, and they do it over the public internet. And they do you know, load balancing amongst agents. It's a very, very interesting. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. And then there's the classic call center agent outfits that have a couple hundred people sitting in a room at a time. And I think that distributed architecture probably is going to win out over time. It probably makes a lot of financial sense from an operating perspective. So I think that's going to continue. And I think the use of the public infrastructure to do that is going to continue. I'll go a little bit of a different place on your question, but I think it's an interesting observation. When we started, there was a huge question as to whether you could carry voice over IP, whether technically it would ever work because of the bandwidth of an individual. It sounds crazy, right? But whether the actual bandwidth of the aggregate could carry the individual 64K calls. And in fact, there's a lot of work, and probably still a lot of work around compression and all that. Today, we don't even think about it. We don't think twice about voice even going over the public infrastructure. And now, some enterprises do. Some enterprises still build big IP VPNs to be able to carry that. But there's still a large number of minutes, of voice minutes, carried over public infrastructure. And I think to the call center question, I think that is an opportunity for folks to change their architecture some too. Go ahead. The question is, can I make some predictions of the uptake of IPv6? Boy, I'm not a good prediction guy, but I think it's there is a day. I mean, it's to me it's obvious that we're going to run out of addresses. The numbering authorities have allocated all IPv4 addresses to all of the regional numbering authorities. So that's happened. So there is no central pool anymore. It's all been distributed out to the Asia Pac, to North America, to ARIN, to RIPE, and all the other places that we hand out addresses. And so we've at least hit step one. There's no single pool anymore. The question is, how long does that tail actually last? There are still lots of providers that have addresses to hand out, so I don't think the day is imminent, but at some point we will reach a point where we have to move to IPv6 infrastructure. As a provider, we have moved there. We carry IPv6 on our network natively. The great news is that our recent acquisition, their network actually did a pretty good job with IPv6, so we have a good platform. From an end customer perspective, I think it's still a little nascent. I think that folks are not yet there saying, I'm going to number every end system, every phone, every computer with an IPv6 address, and that part really needs to happen. From a technology perspective, there is, in my opinion, a huge opportunity to help in the transition from IPv4 to IPv6 with NAT, with network address translation. That's not a popular opinion. I know a lot of people that are IPv6 proponents would say that NATs are a crutch. I'm all for crutches if they help us get there in the long run. So I do think that that's an opportunity. It'd be interesting. I haven't thought about it enough, but it'd be interesting to see if the Asterisk platform has a role to play in that NAT. Go ahead.
So every device now needs a DIP to be reachable, like area code number. Do you see that changing?
The question is, every device now needs to be reachable, and I'm not sure I could. With a DID number. I'm not sure I have an opinion. I think eventually, every device needs to be reachable, period. How that happens and through what mechanism, I'm not sure matters as much. I know this whole notion of a universal identifier has been around for a long time, and whether you're a E.164 proponent or a phone number proponent or an IPv6 proponent. I don't know. I'm sure that the first part of your statement is exactly right. Every device needs to be reachable. One more question? Go ahead.
Yeah, so level 3 struggled a bit with the Broadwing acquisition a few years back. Can you tell us a little bit how it's going with Global Crossing and can we maybe expect to see some of their product portfolio available to commercial customers?
Sure. And it's early days. We closed our transaction on October 4th, so we're 23 days into our actual integration execution. You're asking the opinion of the person that had to develop the plan, so you're going to get a biased answer. I think we have a great plan. I think now the job is for us to execute. And yeah, the goal is over time, if the either product portfolio has a particular thing that's interesting and relevant to the market, we absolutely want to continue that and make it grow. So yeah, I would look if there are things in the market that they were doing that we should continue, by all means send me a note. And if not, I think you can expect that if they were flourishing and growing and had a good financial basis, that we will continue and try to grow them. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.